It was fourth period, and we were in the middle of a titration lab in the big chemistry wing. The air already smelled faintly of weak acid, which is normal. Then, the alarm system, not the fire alarm, but the internal emergency alert, shrieked to life. The principal's voice, which was usually calm, was clipped and distorted. "Attention, all faculty. There is a confirmed, uncontrolled level 3 hazmat situation in the science wing. Secure all locations immediately. This is not a drill. Level 3 is the worst kind, meaning potential immediate danger." Mr. Finn, our chemistry teacher, didn't hesitate. He was trained for this. He yelled, "Hazmat protocol, now! Door sealed, shut off gas, under the benches." I was closest to the supply cabinet, so I grabbed the duct tape and plastic sheeting we keep for spills. Leo was already on the main gas valve, cranking it shut. Sarah was running to shut the fume hood. We didn't talk, we were just in motion. We ripped the plastic and tape, sealing the door frame completely from top to bottom, making a perfect airlock. We were proud of how fast we moved. We were safe. We were all huddled low against the concrete island benches, the only safe spot if the ceiling collapsed. The lights were still on, but the low humming of the exhaust fans had stopped. It was silent except for our breathing. We felt secure because we had created our own little sealed-off bubble. But then, the smell started to change. I leaned my head back, sniffing the air. It wasn't that sharp, vinegary smell of sulfuric acid or the metallic bite of a sodium fire. This smell was thick and sickly sweet, and it hit the back of your throat. It was gasoline. Or maybe lighter fluid. Something that didn't belong in any high school chemistry lab, period. I looked at Mr. Finn, who was kneeling with his hand hovering over the phone, and his face was white. He took a huge, slow breath and whispered, "That is not a chemical leak. That is an accelerant." We realized our terrible mistake immediately. By following the hazmat protocol, we hadn't sealed ourselves out of the danger. We had sealed ourselves in with a very volatile substance that was now seeping under the walls and through the ventilation ducts. Panic hit us fast, but Mr. Finn shut it down. "Quiet. If it's an accelerant, someone is coming to finish the job." That's when it clicked for all of us. The emergency alarm wasn't meant to save us, it was meant to isolate us. It cleared the entire hallway so whoever this was could focus on the one place they couldn't be interrupted, the science wing. Then we heard him. It was a sharp, rhythmic clinking sound coming from the main hallway outside our taped-up door. It sounded like metal hitting the floor, getting closer, but irregularly, like someone was dragging something heavy or maybe just walking with a terrible limp. Leo was staring at the clock on the wall, his eyes huge. The clinking stopped right outside our door. We couldn't see anything through the plastic sheeting, but the silence on the other side was deafening. Suddenly, a flash of red appeared, right at the bottom edge of the door. It wasn't blood. It was a metal canister, the kind they use for storing gas at a construction site. It rolled slightly against the door, stopped, and then someone kicked it, hard, into the center of the plastic sheet. The whump sound as the metal hit the plastic was followed by a sickening hiss as the nozzle opened. The sickly sweet smell of the accelerant, now concentrated, exploded through the tiny hole where the tape wasn't perfectly sealed. The moment that smell hit us, Mr. Finn knew. He pointed a trembling finger at the chemical shelving. "We're not hiding anymore. Cat, grab the distilled water bottles. Leo, the fire extinguisher. Sarah, those are the emergency sand buckets, start filling the sinks and overflow drains. We turn this lab into a fortress." My heart was pounding, but I was focused. This wasn't a school, it was now a battleground. I grabbed 2 liters of distilled water, knowing that water was the universal fire retardant, and started drenching the floor along the bottom of the door, hoping to create a barrier. Leo pulled the heavy fire extinguisher off the wall and held it like a gun, ready to spray. As we were moving, the clinking sound started again, but now it was frantic. The person outside was clearly trying to tear through the plastic seal. We heard a sharp RIP followed by the sickening sound of a knife blade scraping against metal, the lock plate. "He's cutting the seal," Leo whispered, readying the extinguisher. I glanced over at the main bench. Right there, in the open, was a large jar of potassium permanganate crystals and a bottle of glycerin, two common chemicals that, when mixed in large amounts, spontaneously combust. It was crazy, reckless, and terrifying. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before he broke in, and we had to decide if we were going to use the most dangerous things in the room to save ourselves. The plastic at the top corner of the door ripped away, and a single, gloved hand reached in and fumbled for the light switch. Click. The lights in the lab instantly went dark. We were plunged into pitch blackness, save for the faint green glow from the emergency exit sign over the window. In that fraction of a second, I yelled, "The window!" Sarah and Leo simultaneously slammed the emergency latch on the window and shoved, cracking the glass and forcing the frame open with a shriek of bending metal. The airlock was broken. But Mr. Finn didn't run. He grabbed the potassium permanganate and the glycerin. He didn't even mix them. Instead, he reached over to the main lab bench, found the small Bunsen burner, and screwed it onto the gas line again. He opened the main gas valve just a crack. He didn't light the burner. He just let the residual gas leak out, filling the room with a heavier, colorless gas. The hand at the door was now tearing the remaining plastic down, and the intruder stepped inside, silhouetted against the bright hallway. He was a tall guy wearing a hoodie, and in his hand, we saw the glint of a simple road flare, his lighter. "I'm going to make this quick," the intruder hissed. Mr. Finn, standing near the chemical shower, yelled, "Hit the fire alarm, now!" As the main fire alarm blared, drowning out the silence, Mr. Finn hurled the jar of potassium permanganate and the bottle of glycerin directly at the intruder. The chemicals didn't ignite instantly, but the surprise was enough. The intruder stumbled back, dropping his road flare right into the puddle of accelerant that was leaking under the door. Hump! The floor lit up in a wave of bright, angry orange. The smoke instantly filled the doorway. That was our chance. We scrambled over the benches and out the window, diving into the flower beds below, the sound of the main fire sprinkler system now exploding inside the lab, mixing with the sirens that were finally arriving. We were shaken, burned by the rush, but alive, because a science teacher was crazy enough to turn his lab into a chemical bomb and his students were brave enough to follow protocol only to break it when it mattered most. It was just a regular Tuesday, 5th period, English Lit. Ms. Reed was droning on about Shakespeare, and honestly, I was half asleep. Then, the overhead speaker crackled. It wasn't the principal, it was the automated security voice, which is a million times worse. It just said, "Code red lockdown. Secure your location immediately. Remain silent." No explanation. No practice drill warning. Ms. Reed didn't even yell. She just pointed toward the back corner behind her big oak desk. Quietly. Now. The drill response was muscle memory for us. Mark and I helped her push the bookshelves over the door's main lock, and Ms. Reed killed the lights. We all piled into that back corner, crammed next to the teacher's heavy file cabinet. It was total silence except for our breathing, and the only light was the faint gray glow leaking in from the single, small window in the door. I figured we'd be there for an hour, so I reached into my backpack for something to read. I pulled out my vintage 2021 yearbook. I was always flipping through old ones, and settled down, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. We'd been quiet for about 10 minutes, and the anxiety was thick enough to chew on. That's when we heard the chaos. It wasn't screaming like in the movies, it was worse. It was the sound of someone methodically testing doors. We heard it 2 doors down first, a loud rattle and clang as a handle was yanked, followed by a heavy boom as something solid was thrown against the wood. They were trying to force their way in. The sound moved closer. Clang. Boom. It was at the room right next to ours. I instinctively pressed myself harder against the file cabinet. Mark was silently crying next to me. Ms. Reed had her hands clasped, staring at the door. I was trying to distract myself, so I kept flipping through the yearbook, focusing on the blurry group photos from when I was a freshman. I found the section for the freshman class officers, a picture taken outdoors, slightly overexposed. I noticed a figure in the background, a face that was somehow dark and slightly blurred, standing too close to the edge of the frame. Something about the way his shoulders were hunched struck me as vaguely familiar and completely menacing. I looked closer, squinting at the name below the photo block, Ethan K. Expelled, for years ago, for the fire in the AV room. I whispered to Mark, Ethan K. Do you remember the fire? He just shook his head, too scared to speak. Ms. Reed heard me, though. Her eyes snapped to mine, and they were wide with fear, not confusion. She had been on the disciplinary committee that expelled him. I went back to the picture, tracing the outline of that blurred face with my finger. That menacing shape, the dark eyebrows, the hard line of his jaw, it was the face of someone who hadn't just been angry, he'd been malicious. I suddenly remembered the whispers, that Ethan K. was obsessed with getting revenge on the students who had testified against him. Most of those students were now seniors, and many of them, including me, had classes on this floor. Then, the terrible noise stopped right outside our door. The bookshelf barricade made it impossible to open, but the small glass panel was still exposed. We heard a soft, horrifying scrape as something, a ring, a fingernail, ran across the glass panel. It was quiet, calculated, and terrifyingly close. Ms. Reed mouthed the words, "Don't move." The scraping stopped. There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like a year. Then, slowly, something dark and solid began to fill the small glass rectangle. It wasn't the silhouette of a teacher checking on us. It was a face, pressed flat against the glass, just inches away from where we were hiding. It was him. Ethan K. The years hadn't been kind. His face was gaunt, his eyes were sunken and dark, but the menace was exactly the same as the blur in the yearbook photo. He wasn't yelling or banging, he was just staring. He knew we were in there, and he was taking his time. He didn't even try to handle. He just held his face there, moving his eyes slowly, deliberately, over the dark classroom, looking for any shift, any hint of movement. It was a terrifying game of hide-and-seek where he already knew the rules. Mark whimpered, a small, involuntary sound. It wasn't loud, but in that silence, it was like a megaphone. The face in the glass smiled. It was a slow, sickening, confirming smile. He hadn't just found a random room, he had found us. The smile vanished as quickly as it came. He leaned back just enough to break eye contact, and we heard the sound of heavy boots slowly dragging away from our door. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He just moved on, knowing that we were trapped and that he had confirmed his target. The methodical clang. Boom. Started again, a few doors down, moving deeper into the senior wing. Ms. Reed, despite being terrified, was the first to move. She reached under the desk, grabbed her discarded cell phone, and silently started typing. It was a direct text to the administration, not 911. "He's here. Ethan K., black hoodie. Moving toward the 600 wing. Targeted." I realized he wasn't trying to cause mass chaos, he was performing a surgical attack. He used the lockdown as a way to clear the hallways and force his specific targets, the former witnesses, to be locked into predictable locations. And he had just marked our room. We were still alive, but we were sealed into the next room on his list. The moment the main alarm was lifted, we would be the easiest targets. We sat there, paralyzed, listening to the heavy, deliberate sounds of him continuing his search, knowing that the real danger wasn't over, it had just been temporarily postponed. We couldn't just sit there. Ethan K. was hunting specific people, and he knew where we were. Ms. Reed had her phone, but she was worried about making noise talking to the police. I looked around the room, which was filled with typical English class junk, stacks of old books, a broken cassette player, and Ms. Reed's supply cart. I pointed to a small, cheap radio near the window. I whispered, "The PA system is cut, but the emergency frequency should be open. If we can get a message out on a radio, he'll hear it." Ms. Reed shook her head. "Too slow." "But the radio has speakers." She grabbed the radio, ripped the back panel off, and silently pulled out the speaker wire. Then, she looked at Mark, who was still shaking. "Mark, you're the fastest runner. If we get the barricade open, you bolt the other way." Mark looked terrified, but he nodded. I had the idea. I looked at Ms. Reed's purse, which was sitting on the desk. "We can use the sound to turn him around. And his target is the senior wing." Ms. Reed nodded, then pulled a small electronic key fob from her purse. It was her personal car alarm remote. She taped the speaker wire to the key fob and wrapped the whole thing in a heavy wool scarf. Her plan was genius. She was going to throw the key fob decoy down the hallway away from the main exit, triggering the car alarm to make him think his target had escaped to the other side of the building. We waited until the methodical clang. Boom. Sounds were distant, maybe 2 corridors away. Ms. Reed gave us the signal. We moved the bookshelf silently, an inch at a time, until the lock mechanism was just barely clear. Mark was already crouched by the door, ready to spring. I grabbed the door handle, took one last look at Ms. Reed's terrified, determined face, and we acted. Ms. Reed hurled the scarf-wrapped key fob with surprising force out the cracked door. The moment it hit the linoleum floor, the loudest, most jarring car alarm you've ever heard blasted through the empty hallway. The effect was instantaneous. The distant clang. Boom. Stopped. We heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots sprinting back toward us, going in the opposite direction from the real exit. "Go!" Ms. Reed screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the blare of the alarm. Mark shot out the door and sprinted left, toward the parking lot and the emergency stairs. I followed him, running for my life, my heart hammering against my ribs. We didn't look back. We didn't stop until we burst out the main back doors, crashing into the sunlight where security guards and police were finally setting up a perimeter. We were safe. But the car alarm, Ms. Reed's old Honda key fob, was still shrieking in the hallway, pulling Ethan K. further away from the only people who mattered. They finally found him locked in an old supply closet on the far end of the building, still trying to break down the door where the alarm was blaring. He wasn't armed with a gun, he was armed with the heavy metal handle he had ripped off a locker. And he was shaking, realizing he had been played by the same students he came back to terrorize. So, it was late, maybe 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. We were deep into dress rehearsal for Macbeth, right? The main lights were dimmed, just the bare-bones work lights were on. Mr. Davies, our drama teacher, was totally stressed, but he was also a total weirdo, the kind who'd swap all the sugar in the faculty lounge with salt just for a laugh. We were running the final dagger scene, and suddenly, he stops us. He pulls out his phone and reads a text, and his eyes go wide. He coughs, like he's trying to sound official, and then he says, "All right, people. This is not a drill. We have a code red lockdown. Secure the space, and silence your lives." We all froze, looking around. Liam, the lead, just rolled his eyes and whispered, "Nice one, Davies. What's the prop this time? A rubber chicken?" Davies never broke character, though. He was already scurrying over to the door, pulling out the big wooden wedge we used to prop it open, and sliding the heavy metal security bar across. He turns back to us, his face half-shadowed, and says, "Under the stage, now. Chloe, your stage manager corner. No talking, no lights." It took us a few seconds, but we finally started moving, totally convinced this was just the elaborate climax of a massive, pre-planned drama club prank. We'd even started debating who he paid to send the fake text. We were crammed into the stage left wing, behind the curtain line where all the sandbags and ropes are. Davies had shut off the work lights, too. Now the only light in the entire massive auditorium was the ghost light, that single, caged bulb they leave on center stage to ward off, well, ghosts, and keep people from tripping. It was creepy, but still, we were whispering about how committed Davies was to the bit. Maya even snickered, asking, "Is he going to play a spooky sound effect now?" But then, 5 minutes went by, and Davies hadn't said gotcha. He was crouched by the door we just barred, his face pressed to the tiny crack, and he was absolutely silent. The typical humming of the old theater air conditioning, a noise we never noticed until it stopped, went dead. Everything was suddenly pitch black and silent, except for the tiny circle of yellowish light from the ghost light way out on the stage. That's when my stomach dropped. I realized Davies hadn't even locked his usual prank door lock, which was always just a padlock. He'd used the real steel security bar. I looked at him, and his eyes weren't joking anymore. They were wide with genuine, terrified uncertainty. We were totally quiet for maybe 2 more minutes. You could hear the dust settle. Then, we all heard it at the exact same time. It wasn't loud, but in that kind of silence, it was like a gunshot. Scrape. Scrape. It was the sound of a heavy rubber sole dragging slowly across the bare concrete of the main hallway outside the theater entrance. Liam, the big actor, choked on a breath. Maya started silently shaking. Davies pulled back from the crack, and his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. It's not me. That wasn't the plan." He looked completely destroyed. Then the scraping stopped right by the main theater doors, the ones that lead into the auditorium from the lobby. The ones we had just barred shut. We heard the faint but unmistakable rattle of the crash bar. Someone was trying the outside handle. Not aggressively, not like a panic, but slowly, deliberately. And then, there was a terrible, deep, scratching sound as something heavy and metallic scraped along the face of the door, right where the security bar was. It wasn't the handle anymore, it was the bar itself being tested for weakness. We finally realized this wasn't the teacher who joked about death, this was death itself, checking to see if we had locked up tight enough. We knew we couldn't stay by the door, the wall was too thin. Davies pointed frantically toward the back wall of the wing, which had a small, barely used door leading into the costume shop hallway. "Go! Go! Costume shop, then the fly rail ladder," he hissed. We moved like shadows, But as we reached the door, we heard a terrifying new sound, a dull, rhythmic thud, thud, thud coming from inside the auditorium. The intruder hadn't gotten through the front doors. They had found the maintenance entrance on the other side of the building. They were now on the catwalks, high above the main seats, moving across the lighting grid. That's when I took charge. As the stage manager, I knew the building's secrets. "Wait. Costume shop is a dead end," I whispered. "He knows the catwalks. That's Mr. Vance's old territory." Mr. Vance was a disgruntled tech teacher who'd been fired last year. I pointed up at the massive, heavy blackout curtain hanging from the fly rail, barely visible in the dark. "Liam, we need to drop the main traveler. Maya, get to the soundboard, use the thunder cue on loop. Davies, we need to get to the fire alarm panel, but we need distraction." As Liam silently climbed the ropes to release the curtain, and Maya scurried out through a gap to the sound booth, I looked at Davies. He grabbed a massive, plastic skull prop off a shelf, the Yorick skull we used in Act V. He gave a single, terrifying nod, no hint of a joke left, and we both knew we were going to use the theater, the only place we had ever called home, to fight back. The sheer noise that erupted next was our shield. First, there was Maya. She hit the thunder cue, but she didn't just hit it, she slammed the volume up, way past what the old speakers could handle. The sound of a massive, crackling thunderstorm exploded through the auditorium, loud enough to feel in your chest. At the same instant, Liam, he was amazing, cut the rope lock. That giant, thick, velvet main traveler curtain that separates the stage from the audience dropped like a guillotine. It was probably 80 feet wide and felt like it weighed a ton. It hit the floor with a terrifying whump that swallowed the ghost light's faint glow. Total black out. The intruder, Mr. Vance, had been up on the lighting grid, walking across those narrow metal bars right above the seats. The crash must have completely disoriented him. We heard a terrifying, desperate yell that echoed above the booming sound of the storm, followed by the metallic clang of something heavy falling from the grid and hitting the wooden floor of the balcony seats. It wasn't the sound of a body, thank God, but something metal and heavy, maybe a wrench or a light stand. It was the sound of someone completely losing their balance and their bearing. This was our moment. The sound of the thunder cue kept looping, making the entire building feel unstable and insane. We didn't stop for a second. Davies, still clutching that plastic skull like it was a weapon, bolted toward the fire alarm pole station. This was risky. It would pull the cops and the fire department, but it would also instantly turn on the emergency lights, making us visible. "Wait!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Vance is armed, he could be downstairs now." Instead, I pointed to the lighting board, which had its own dedicated safety power. I flipped the first master fader. The stage suddenly flooded with blinding, searing white light from the work lights high above the wings. It was a calculated risk. It would blind anyone who'd been moving in the dark, but it gave us just enough visibility to see the door we needed. We bolted for the small emergency exit door backstage. Davies kicked the crash bar, and the door flew open, letting in the cool night air and the blessed sound of crickets. As we scrambled out, I looked back just for a second. The whole stage was an absolute mess. The curtain was down, the thunder was still booming, and the work lights were burning. And then I saw it. Near the stage manager's desk, in the center of the blinding white light, was a dark silhouette. Mr. Vance was standing perfectly still, momentarily paralyzed by the shock and the sound, looking directly at where we had just been. We ran. We didn't stop until we hit the street and saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police car already pulling up. Someone had heard the thunder and the commotion and called them. When they finally went inside and found Vance, he wasn't armed with a gun, but he had a bag full of wire cutters, duct tape, and a long, heavy length of chain. He was there to systematically disable the entire theater, rigging the fly system and power panels to cause maximum chaos during opening night. Davies's prank, the fake lockdown, had literally saved our lives by putting the heavy security bar on the door 5 minutes before Vance was able to cut his way inside.